Welcome to the Franciscan Spirituality Center in La Crosse, Wisconsin's What is Spirituality podcast. Your host, Steve Spildy, is the Associate Director at the Center. His guests talk about their evolving understanding of God, prayer, healing, and wholeness.
Welcome. I am excited today because my guest is Linda Kerrigan, one of the very wise mentors in my life. She is a friend. She was a long-term teammate. We worked together in the spiritual direction preparation program. If there's anything I know about spiritual direction, chances are it came to me through Linda. And so it's my sincere pleasure to be joined by her today. Welcome, Linda.
Well, thank you, Steve. And I'm happy and honored to be invited for this opportunity. It means a lot to me.
Well, since I've given you credit for teaching me about spiritual direction, I'd like to hear from you. Describe your understanding of what spiritual direction is and what is it you do when you're sitting with someone.
Well, I think over the years, often we've been asked in our own ministry of spiritual direction, that question comes up, basically, what the heck am I doing? And what is this, that we call spiritual direction? So I think a very simple and basic description I read, and I like it very much. Spiritual direction is walking home together. Walking home together. And it brings to mind the Emmaus story where the disciples were walking and Jesus showed up along the way. That is what happens in spiritual direction. It's not just walking together, but it's joining heart to heart, being open to your own vulnerability and that of the other person. It's about sharing compassion. As a spiritual director, it's about inviting the person to be in touch with their inner wisdom. I think more often than not, people do not credit themselves with having a deep well of wisdom. And sometimes just putting words and language around that get a person to, a light bulb goes off like, oh, really? You think I have something inside me? Of course you do, because God has placed it there for you to access. It's a profound experience. It's meeting a person on sacred ground, honoring that sacred ground, and inviting them to share their story in a way that I'm there as spiritual director to receive that story, hold that story, honor it, and assure my directee that yours is a sacred story.
Spiritual direction, can you break that down for me? Just the words, or spiritual director. What's your understanding of what we're talking about when we use the word spiritual, and what's your understanding of director?
Spiritual goes way beyond the confines of religion. Spiritual is, to me, in the everyday sacred. Spiritual has to do with notion or the belief that all are connected. When I was on a retreat once, it was a very profound piece that my spiritual director offered me, and that is God is everywhere, and not only everywhere, but equally everywhere. And also beyond that, that God is within us. When I think about spiritual versus religion, to me, religion is limiting and confining, and spiritual embraces all, and wholeness and possibility and wonder and awe and concepts that we haven't even imagined. So it's very embracing, it's inclusive, it's for everyone to make some kind of connection. Whereas religion, again, I think is just more confining and associated with church buildings and dogma and rules and so on. That's what spiritual means for me. And the other is, as I sat and thought about spiritual and spirituality, I don't think I had that word in my vocabulary until I was in my 50s. And I think what helped me have a greater understanding of spirituality was the programming, the relationships through the Franciscan Spirituality Center. That was a wonderful invitation and an opportunity for immersion for myself to have expand my understanding of what spiritual means.
As your understanding of spirituality started to evolve, in what ways did your life change, or in what ways did you start to practice your spirituality in new ways?
One experience, I think, that kind of drew me in, having the opportunity for a pilgrimage to Assisi, there was such a found presence of spirit. I was very, very overcome by a sense of, and the word I had for it then was humility. I was just overcome with humility. I felt so very small as I moved about the streets of Assisi and followed in the footsteps of Francis and Clare. But my smallness, it wasn't like I felt minimal or minimized, but it was just because I was overcome with feeling humbled. The Spirit was so alive in the various places that we visited where Claire and Francis lived out their life and where they prayed and lived and so on. You could just sense that there was something happening in these places, and you just sensed it in your body. That experience changed me. It was a conversion kind of thing. I came back home, and from there I then began to pursue becoming a Franciscan affiliate with the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration, and then that led to signing up for the Spiritual Direction Preparation Program. So I just felt like I felt really drawn to live out this feeling of and connection with a greater spirituality in my life versus a limited religious practice.
Just for people who don't know what we're talking about, the pilgrimage to Assisi, the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration in La Crosse have a program where some of their long-term employees, they think it's important for them to walk in the footsteps of their tradition's founder, St. Francis, to walk in his personal footsteps. And Francis lived a long time ago, back in the 1200s in Assisi, Italy. And my understanding is that your husband worked for the sisters, and so that's how you had the opportunity to go to Assisi, correct?
Right, yeah. Spouses were invited to go along, yes.
Explain to people why the sisters would make that investment. Why was it so important? I mean, because it's a significant investment to send people to the other side of the world to spend a week or 10 days walking in the footsteps of someone who lived 800 years ago.
The sisters are very wise. They are always looking forward. Given their sponsored institutions at the time, Pat worked at Viterbo University, which was a sponsored institution. They felt very strongly that key people in leadership in particular really needed to have a fuller understanding of mission and ministry. The sisters are well aware of their declining numbers and their need to let go of sponsored institutions, at least in a financial way. They felt profound responsibility to immerse their key people in Franciscan values, understanding, history, to have an immersion experience so that they could have a profound connection and bring that back to their institutions and to their workplace and to the people they serve. In the case of the university students and those who were at Mayo, to maybe refigure or at least deepen the way that they were already providing servant leadership to assure that Franciscan values were at the basis, their work in mission and ministry. At this point, there's probably been, several hundred people, at least maybe 200-300 people for sure, that have had this wonderful opportunity because of the sisters' investment.
So what I'm hearing you say is that pilgrimage, that trip to Assisi, really reshaped your understanding of what we mean by spirituality or faith or God or spirit, correct?
Right. And it also got me to be thinking about, where am I going in life? What is it about? How can I live out mission and ministry? Coming back from that experience has changed from being in the counseling field to being drawn to spiritual direction as a work career opportunity.
So this experience helped you make your spirituality, is it fair to say, embodied? It became a body experience, not just simply an experience of your mind, a thinking experience?
Definitely. I probably have never been so much of a head level person anyway. I think I'm more connected with gut level and intuition and the heart space. So it just kind of made that more expansive and stronger.
Being able to walk in the footsteps of Francis was much more powerful than just simply reading about him or hearing about him.
Absolutely. I don't mean to say that everybody has to make a pilgrimage to Assisi to make that happen for them. I'm just saying that is how it happened for me. And it was life-changing and impacting my outlook and my way of being in the world.
That fits with my understanding of you and who you are as a spiritual director, because my sense, though, is that many times people come perhaps to you as a spiritual director, and their understanding of God or their understanding of what it means to live a life of faith really is a lot in their head. It's come to them through a book. It's come to them through preaching, but yet they're struggling to connect that with their own life experience. And so you as a spiritual director are really helping them to find that story within their own life.
Yeah, indeed. Again, I think the beauty of spiritual direction is have that position, that environment, the atmosphere of openness, accepting that people just come who they are, where they are. And it's not my job to move them along or teach a certain way of understanding, but again, just honoring who that person is, where they are coming from, trusting that God is present in them, God is working in them. It's not my work, it is God's work, but God has called me to be part of whatever transformation, openness that might happen for that individual. What I find the other challenge, and I really do appreciate the challenge of people who come that have fallen away from their faith practice or maybe have had no faith practice whatsoever. And yet what I see in them is a deep, deep longing and hunger for connection. They often can't explain, they don't understand it. And to be present to that person, to journey in a deeper understanding or new way of seeing things, that is just, I'm so honored to be able to be with those people. And I'll just kind of just go back a little bit with that. And I think what helped me in that, I came from a family of, my mother was the practicing Catholic. My father did not have a religion. He referred to himself as an atheist. I think he was perhaps more of an agnostic, but he did not have any specific belief. And so growing up, I realized it later that I was gifted. My mother gave me the gift of faith. I still am a practicing Catholic today. And my father gave me the gift of questioning. So I have had that kind of balance in my life. And so I understand people who are questioning and doubting. That has helped me receive someone like that.
Can you remember your early experiences receiving spiritual direction? What was it that led you to seek out a spiritual director?
It was before I was in the SDPP program, because there it's a requirement. You need to be in spiritual direction. But I think what it was that caused me to seek out spiritual direction was because of this Assisi trip. I had not flown on an airplane for 22 years. I developed a fear of flying, and I made it up in my mind, I'm not going to fly again because it's just too anxiety producing. I can't do this. What if I have a heart attack on an airplane? All these, crazy paranoid ideas. But anyway, I was resolute that I wanted to go on this Assisi trip. And I talked about it with my husband. He understood my fear of flying. He says, you know what? I think you need to see a spiritual director and to help prepare and get through this. That's what compelled me to seek spiritual direction. And so in that, I was able to explore my fears. It was very helpful when my spiritual director asked me to image, when I'm on that plane, image that Jesus is sitting beside me, holding me, and image that I would be safe and that I would not be alone and it would be okay. That's what really helped prepare me.
You've mentioned your upbringing, that your mother was very faithfully Catholic and that your father was not. Can you share a bit what you learned from each of them and how both of them still live inside you now?
They were married by a priest, and he had to sign a paper or something that said he would agree to children being raised Catholic. And so that's what happened. We were all 6 children raised Catholic. I grew up in a neighborhood that was primarily Lutheran. There was our family and one other family where we lived in town, which was 10 miles away in the Catholic Church. Otherwise, it was highly populated with Lutherans. My Lutheran friends and neighbors, often I was told, your dad's going to go to hell because he doesn't believe in God. Of course, that's pretty disturbing talk with a young child. So I'd go home to my mother and ask about that. And she was always very reassuring. And she would say, now you think about your dad. You know your dad is a good man. He takes care of us. He helps people. Do you think that the God we believe in would send your dad to hell? I'd say no. And she goes, that's right. So you don't ever have to worry about that. I want you to pray that someday your dad will go to church. What I got from her, that kind of reassurance. My dad, my mother, they were both great people offering hospitality, often told us kids to give others the benefit of the doubt. They were non-judging people. They welcomed others to the home. They were all about helping the neighbors, being there for other people. They were great models of goodness and kindness and charity. And then in the end, my prayer was finally answered. It was on the day of my mother's funeral. That's when he finally went to church.
would you be able to share your feelings on that day?
I felt a little sorry for my dad because I know it was really, really hard for him to be in a church. And of course, he was there grieving the death of his wife. But I was also very proud of him that he could do this and that he could honor her memory in that way. It was mixed feelings.
So he really did do that as an honor to her.
Yes, he did. Yeah, he did. And not only that, but over their lifetime, they would go back and forth about where they were going to be buried. And of course, he was bound and determined not to be in any cemetery. And so she says, well, I'd like to be in the Catholic cemetery. Well, you do what you need to do, and I'm going to be buried in our backyard under the apple tree. Over time, she softened and she says, okay, I'll be buried under the apple tree too, but you must have a Catholic priest there to bless the ground. And again, he honored that. A Catholic priest was, took care of that and was present.
Did he ever go to church besides that?
This is a funny story. The only other time I remember him going to church was he didn't go to my wedding or none of our weddings, but he ended up probably a couple years after I was married deciding to go to the wedding of a neighbor boy. And this is in a Lutheran church. I'm thinking, oh my word, are you kidding me? You wouldn't go to your daughter's wedding, but you're going to go to the neighbor boy. So anyway, we were invited to the wedding too. So Pat and I went along. I knew kind of how my dad would be in church. He just gets really nervous. So we go into church and the wedding is about to start. We're sitting in the pew with him and he's loud and he's talking to people around. Oh, hi, Joe. How are you doing? Haven't seen you in a while. And he's just like visiting loudly with people. Finally, the service begins. So I'm telling him, quiet down, Daddy. Stop. The wedding has started. Okay. And he's very nervous. His foot is shaking and he's nervous. I could just tell he was so uncomfortable. And so I nudged my husband. I said, Pat, you need to get him out of here. He says, okay, go. And then so he elbows my dad. He goes, Pat, let's go outside and have a cigarette. And he loudly says, cigarette? Kerrigan, don't you know you can't smoke in church? What are you talking about? And I just said, Pat, get him out. And he says, okay, Kerrigan, fine. I'll go out and have a cigarette with you. Thankfully, my husband kept him out of that wedding service until it was over.
Do you have any idea where his nervousness at being in church came from?
I'm not really sure what would make him so nervous. He was comfortable talking with neighboring Lutheran pastor would stop over have coffee with my dad and mom. And he was very comfortable, talking one-on-one with a priest or a pastor in our home. He would never seek one out. His parents did not have any faith practice, that at least they didn't rear their children in that way. They were married by a Lutheran pastor. I'm thinking as I kind of trace their history and figure out really what happened here. So my grandparents, their first child died at age 2, and then they had twins, a boy and a girl. They died after 3 days. I'm just thinking that after the deaths of their first 3 children, my suspicion is that they were questioning what kind of a God would take away our kids. We're done. I think that's what happened. I think they just drifted away.
So what I'm hearing, your father wasn't a great role model for you in your religious practice, but yet
Right.
Knowing you, I do sense that he was a model for you in your spiritual practice. So could you talk about some of the ways that he was a model for you in that regard?
He would hospitality and his generosity and his goodness and his loyalty. My mother had mental health issues throughout her life. When I think back on it, there would have been more than one good reason or experiences where my father could have just said, you know what, I'm leaving the marriage, I'm done. But no, he was loyal throughout. He saw to it that when she needed to go to a state mental institution for treatment, he made sure that she got what she needed. I remember once saying, Daddy, the neighbors, they talk about Mom and that maybe she's crazy or something. He says, don't you worry about what anybody is talking about. She cannot help herself, and don't be listening to other people. So again, it was his loyalty, his caring for the family, his resilience, kind of moving one step ahead of the other. Even when my mother died, her death was by suicide. And my father, what he said about that, he says, life is for the living and we are going to go on living. As he came near the end of his life, he outlived his brothers. He had 4 brothers. When he was at the funeral of the last brother who died, he insisted that a note be put in his brother's coffin. He had it written in Finnish. We asked him, what did that say in Finnish? In Finnish, it said, Nekamin. Well, Daddy, what does that mean? He said, it means till we meet again. So come on. I think he was fooling himself and fooling us during a lot of life that I think he had some kind of belief that, yeah, we will meet again.
As you talk about your experience, and thank you for sharing, you talk about your mother, you talk about your dad, your mother being very faithful, very religious, your dad not having, traditional spiritual practice or religious practice. But yet, knowing you and the way you described your dad, I'm wondering if your dad was more of an example to you of how you work as a spiritual director, how you show up with people. Could you reflect on that?
Again, I think it's that openness to people. It's not judging people, trusting that people are striving for greater clarity. Yeah, to me, it was just openness and accepting people where they are. There were so many examples of that growing up where he'd pick up any hitchhiker off the road with no concern for himself. I remember him inviting a drunk guy who was walking down the road in front of our place and telling Archie, come on, you need a bed to sleep in, and letting him stay overnight in his drunken state. It's just like, grief.
Very, very generous of spirit.
Yeah, and he was a teetotaler himself, and yet when a friend came to visit from Russia and brought in his bottle of vodka and set it on the kitchen table, my dad didn't say, put it away. He says, help yourself to a drink. I don't want any, but go ahead.
Well, thinking about that openness, that acceptance, I'm guessing that in your experience as a spiritual director, you've sat with many different people.
Yes.
And many people have a very different understanding of what we mean by God. Can you talk about how that's impacted you? What it's like to sit down with someone whose understanding of the word God is so very different from your own?
That's one of the great spiritual questions, is to invite a person to share what is your image of God. And my experience is that our image of God, our names for God, change over time. When I was a little kid, God was the guy in the sky, but he wasn't a scary guy. I just understood that God was a very profound presence that I didn't really understand. I didn't have to understand, but I knew that God was not scary. God wasn't there to punish. God was there to care for us and to love us. I'm very grateful I had that kind of image growing up. And then over time, my names for God have changed. My concept of God has changed. I've always held the notion that God is present and with us. That does not change. When I meet with people and what's your image of God, and ask about their names for God, people really appreciate those kind of questions because most people have never been asked before. And then giving them assurance that whatever your image or whatever your name is for God, it's good. You can hold that, not have to change on it. As I have had the wonderful relationship with the sisters over the years, a very profound experience for me was a sister who was probably a couple months away from dying. She was 102 years old, and asking her the spiritual question, how are you and God doing these days? And she leaned out of her wheelchair and her eyes got so big behind her glasses. And she said, Linda, sometimes God and we just sit in the corner and we laugh. Now, that is one of the most awesome experiences and images of God that I have received from another human being. I love that.
Well, that seems like it might be a good place for us to end today with the question, how are you and God doing these days, Linda?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because just last night, her group of affiliates, we talked about that, were we catching glimpses of God these days? And what came to me and what has stayed with me, especially during this time of challenge and upheaval with the COVID, when I awake in the middle of the night, my mantra is, God is with me. I just breathe that in and out. Know and appreciate and hold the presence that I'm not alone in this. We are not alone. God is with us. That's where my trust is. And that's my hope. That's my belief. That's what keeps me grounded, is knowing God is with us. I'm sitting here looking out in my backyard. I look up into the woods. I see a robin's nest that they've just launched. They're young. It's just life-giving. God's presence just surrounds us. It's our job just to keep noticing.
If you have any questions about any of the programs that they offer at the Franciscan Spirituality Center in La Crosse, Wisconsin, we invite you to call us at 608-791-5295. That's 608-791-5295. You can also visit our website at www.fscenter.org. www.fscenter.org. Thank you for listening.